I'm sitting down today with Cindy Walters, a mother who lost her daughter, Bethany. The circumstances surrounding Bethany's death are something that she has still questions about to this day. Subsequently, there was a situation with a suspect in this case, the suspect, Michael Guillory. The suspect was earlier in December offered a plea deal, an Alford plea, where he does not have to state responsibility, but that the preponderance of what the prosecution has would be enough to convict him. He was offered this Alford plea by District Attorney Chad Peete in St. Landry Parish. This case obviously is haunting to Cindy and her husband, as it would be for any parents who have lost a child. Cindy, I want to thank you for joining me. I want to thank you for talking to me. And I have just a myriad of questions concerning everything surrounding Bethany.
Thank you for having me, Bernie. I really appreciate you taking the time to explore what occurred here.
First off, I want to talk about Bethany. Tell me about Bethany. Tell me about your daughter.
You know, Bethany was 22 years old, like any 22-year-old, trying to find herself in life, trying to find, what her purpose was, what it is I want to do with my life, where do I want to go. Her dad and I are in the medical field, and she wasn't quite sure that's where she wanted to be, but she did try to follow in those footsteps initially. She went to Acadian Ambulances Academy and became a EMS. And then went on to work at Lafayette General in ICU for a little while, and then she worked at the ER in a local community hospital. But really, you could tell that the medical profession was not really where she was going to land permanently. Mm-hmm. And just recently, prior to her demise, in somewhere around November, her dad and Bethany had gone to the University of Houston, and they had toured the campus there and met with an advisor, and she was considering actually going to law school there. And my husband did put a deposit on an apartment there, and she was looking at maybe in the spring moving to Houston and attempting to go to school at the University of Houston.
At the time of her death, was she seeing anyone, and who was she seeing?
Bethany was more of a follower than a leader. Mm-hmm. And, it's okay to be a follower, Bernie. Mm-hmm. Not everybody is meant to champion a cause or take the lead, but we always cautioned her on who you're following and where they're going, and have they arrived where they're going, or are they at a dead end? And I think, Bethany was more of had a lot of social worker in her, I believe.
Really?
She wanted to help people at her own cost, And so sometimes, you have to be able to be wise enough and have some experience under your belt to realize that the person has to be wanting a change, And I think she got caught up in some things, Bernie, where instead of being the influencer, she was influenced and got caught up in the wrong crowd and was easily influenced, you know, but didn't have the opportunity to right the wrong that was taken, never had the opportunity to come full circle, never had the just life experiences to realize, this is not where I want to be, and this is not productive, and we had multiple conversations, who you hang around, the crowd you hang around, the people that you allow to influence and speak into your life, are not healthy. But they have to recognize that, Bernie.
That's right.
They have to recognize that. No matter what, I've always told people, I'm going to say this, and this may not come out right in some people's eyes, but people are labeled, and I guess this is hard, but your trash is your trash, right?
Yeah.
And my Raggedy Ann is my Raggedy Ann.
Right.
And nobody had to take the life of my Raggedy Ann. Nobody had the right to take my Raggedy Ann's life.
Mm-hmm.
And if you considered her Raggedy Ann, it didn't matter. She was mine.
That's right. Still your child.
She was mine.
That's right.
You know, and although choices that she made may have not been good choices, no one had the right to take her life.
Absolutely.
You know, so the opportunity to come to any recognition on her own was taken.
Mm-hmm. Who was Bethany seeing at the time, and where was she living?
Bethany was seeing a young man by the name of Michael Gilry. It was a very short relationship. To my knowledge, they had only been together approximately 2.5 to 3 months. Michael Gilry lived off of the Prudence Highway in Church Point with his parents. And there was some rental property across the street from his parents that I think his dad may have been a caretaker of or an overseer.
Mm-hmm.
And so they put Bethany and Michael in the house across the street from his parents.
Mm-hmm.
I, Bernie, do not believe that this was a long-term
Mm-hmm.
relationship, or would have been a long-term relationship. I believe that it had been a very short-lived relationship, just due to the fact that, you know, she was looking at moving to Houston.
Mm-hmm. Was there ever any discussion? Did Bethany ever discuss with you, was Michael verbally or physically abusive to her?
Yes, we had some conversation about that. Bethany came home one day, and I could tell she was troubled, you know, and she went into her room and laid down, took a nap, and came out. And then she told me that, you know, he had thrown a glass of water in her face.
Mm-hmm.
And I told her, I said, you know, Bethany, I said, a person that does something like that, it escalates. And today it's water. Tomorrow it'll be oil and gas. Mm-hmm. You do not need to go back over there. And we had some conversation actually with his mother. Mm-hmm. And his own mother advised her, you need to stay home with your family. Don't come back out here. There's nothing good for you out here. Michael has nothing to offer you. You know, mm-hmm. You need to stay home. But they had conversation on the phone, and he was persuading her to go back. And she went back. But the day that she left to go back, you know, there had been some argument in our home, and I did tell her, if you go back, don't come back. Mm-hmm. You know, I didn't have a good feeling about this. Mm-hmm. I really didn't. And you know, because he had thrown the water in her face, you know, I'm intelligent enough to know that those things only escalate.
Right, right.
And so I had some concern. I had a lot of concern. I didn't have any good feelings about this relationship at all.
Was there alcohol and substance abuse?
Yes. I'm not sure about the, you know, alcohol, but there was substance abuse on both parts, on both Mr. Gilry and Bethany.
Mm-hmm. Now, what did you come to know about the day that all of this came to a head? Let's put it that way. And how were you notified of your daughter's death?
I feel that day, I see that day, and I relive that day over and over in my mind. Mm-hmm. It was a Monday afternoon at approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It was January the 25th of 2016. I had just pulled out of my parking spot at work, and I was on I-49 in front of Lowe's in Carencro, and my phone rang. And I answered the phone, and the lady said, well, you sound okay, Cindy. And I said, well, I am. Why? And she said, well, what I've heard must be just a rumor. And I said, well, what did you hear? And she paused, and then she said, I heard that Bethany died. And Bernie, I was just rattled to my core. And so I hung up the phone, and I pulled into the IHOP on I-49. And the only thing I could think of was to call the local police department in Church Point. Mm-hmm. And so I did. And the dispatcher said, Ms. Walters, you need to call the St. Leger Parish Sheriff's Department. And so I did. And the lady put me on hold and put a detective on the phone. And then he said, Miss Walters, what time are you going to be home? And I'm intelligent enough to know that if this man didn't tell me to come to a hospital, that you're coming to my house to give me some news that I really don't want to hear today.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew that my husband was home alone, and I have another child that was not home yet, but was only 10 years old at the time. And I gave him an approximate time that I would be home, and then I made some arrangements to make sure that my husband's mother was at my house when I told him, and that my 10-year-old would not be home.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm the one that walked into my home and told my husband. He was watching Fox News.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that vividly.
I'll bet.
In my mind. It's forever stained
Mm-hmm.
on me. And our ordeal began from there, Bernie. It was probably 6:30, 7 o'clock on a cold January evening.
Cindy Walters is the woman who is joining me, and the woman we're speaking to right now. We're talking about the death of her daughter, Bethany, in 2016. At that point, are you met at home by the St. Landry Parish Sheriff's Office? Did detectives come over?
It took quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
We sat and waited. Most people ask why we didn't go out there.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if I could have driven.
No,
I
knew.
I don't know how you got home.
I did not drive. Someone came to get me. I left my car parked at IHOP,
Mm-hmm.
and actually the lady that called me, her and her husband came to get me. And Bernie, it felt like hours waiting on them to come and get me, and then taking me home.
Mm-hmm.
But I made several phone calls from the parking lot of IHOP to get my 10-year-old placed and secured,
Mm-hmm.
and sheltered from
Yes.
the trauma of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And just knowing that I would have to tell my husband that it had to come from me,
Mm-hmm.
Because I wanted to get home before the sheriff's department or the police department did actually get to my house. And I knew, my parents are deceased, and my husband's mother's still living. I knew he would need her there as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so we made the arrangements to get everybody there and our pastor. And then I told him. And it was hours before the police department actually came to our house. This occurred, we live in the town of Church Point. We
Mm-hmm.
live in the city limits. And so this occurred, actually where it occurred is where the St. Landry and Acadia Parish
border
intersect.
just kind of intersect in
they
that.
intersect right there.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one side of the highway is Acadia and the other side St. Landry.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was several hours later before the chief of police from Church Point and the captain from the sheriff's department rang our doorbell.
And came to tell you.
And they came to tell us, and they told us that they didn't know what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
That they had received a 911 call from Michael's dad,
Mm-hmm.
and that Michael was there initially,
Mm-hmm.
but then he left the scene in her car.
Mm.
And at that point, they didn't know where he was.
Mm-hmm.
He had left, and there was they were had put an APB out
For him.
All points bulletin, look out for him, but
Mm-hmm.
didn't know where he was at. But that, initially the call had come in that she had shot herself.
That was the way the call had come in.
The call came in that she had shot herself. So at that point, all we knew was that the 911 call said she shot herself.
Mm-hmm.
And so we didn't know, and they just told us that there was going to be an investigation.
Mm-hmm.
But, right now Michael was not there to question.
When did he surface, and in what manner?
Later that evening, okay, so I got notified somewheres around 5:30, 6 o'clock in the afternoon by the phone call I got. It was probably about 8:30 when the sheriff's department and the local chief of police came to my house. This was about 8:30. It was somewheres around 11:30, midnight that night, that I got a call from the captain, and he asked me if Bethany was right-handed or left-handed. And then I was told that he was found in Livonia, in Point Capee Parish, in a stolen vehicle, and that Bethany's car had been wrecked somewhere off of 190 and abandoned, and it was, and he stole a vehicle in that vicinity. When he was found in Livonia in this stolen vehicle, then they went to the owner's house to see if the owner had given permission for Michael to use this vehicle or if it was stolen. And the elderly gentleman had no idea. He was awakened by the police department. He had no idea that his vehicle had been stolen. He had not given consent for Michael to use the vehicle. When he was stopped in Point Capee Parish, he gave a false name, did not identify himself correctly. He gave the name of someone else and said that he had consent to use that vehicle. Once they recognized that he did not have consent, then they arrested him in Point Capee Parish and held him for St. Landry. And then when the investigators went to the elderly gentleman's house to see if he was aware of his vehicle being stolen or not, they knew Bethany's vehicle had to be somewhere in the vicinity, because this was all rural area. Rural area. Her car had to be somewhere in the vicinity. So her vehicle was found behind someone's house, almost in a pasture area, up against a fruit tree, like an orange tree, still running. It had ran for probably about 5 hours.
My goodness.
But he hit a tree, and then he abandoned it, and then he stole the vehicle and got back on 190 and went heading towards Baton Rouge, or heading east, and was stopped in Livonia, and he had nothing on but a slicker suit and the hat that was in the old man's vehicle. So he had no clothing on other than a pair of boxer shorts.
Which is truly bizarre.
Very bizarre. He had no clothes.
At that point, they told you they thought it was suicide. Did you believe that?
I didn't know what to believe, Bernie, but I did believe this, that there was only 2 people in the house. So rationale tells you that either he did it or she did it, right? You're only going to have 1 or 2 outcomes, So this was the Monday that it actually occurred. The Tuesday, the next day, nothing occurred because her body was at Louisiana Forensics being autopsied. The next day was the Wednesday, was actually my birthday, the 28th. And we got 2 calls that day. We got 1 call from the sheriff's department and 1 call from the funeral home. Funeral home wanted us to come and make arrangements. The sheriff's department wanted to talk to us. So we got dressed, and in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to the sheriff's department. They're going to tell us.
Right. They're going to have information.
They're going to tell us
They're
what
going to tell
happened.
us.
We're going to finally find out.
And why did they ask, is my daughter right-handed, left-handed? Yeah. You're thinking you'll get more information.
So we go over there, and they bring us into this room, and 2 officers come in, and, they get us to state our name and our address and our date of birth and where we work and what we do for a living and, what kind of child was Bethany and, had she ever been in any trouble? Did we know her to use drugs? Did she graduate from high school? Did she have any college? Where had she worked? And then I realized that they're not here to tell us what happened. They're just here gathering
Information.
And part of their investigation is to find out what kind of life she lived, what kind of home she grew up in. Was she on any antipsychotics? Had she ever been treated for psychiatric issues? Had she ever threatened suicide? All of these questions, which she had never been in a behavior unit for psychiatric issues. She had never been to rehab for drugs. She had never been in trouble with the law, other than traffic tickets. So that day was a very empty day because we, in our minds, what we thought were going to be some answers to what occurred, they were still gathering information. Okay, looking back, I can see why that was logical and why that happened, and my expectations of that day were not really realistic. So then we left there, and we go to the funeral home, and we make her arrangements for her funeral. And for 6 months after that, I waited, Bernie.
And just waited.
I'd go to the sheriff's department. I would get nothing. I'd go to the coroner's office. I would get nothing. I'd go to the DA's office, and they would tell me, Miss Walters, until the sheriff's department makes an arrest, we can't prosecute a case we don't have.
Your daughter was right-handed. Where was she shot?
She was shot on the left side of the head, on the upper, right above the eye, forehead, left side. She's right-handed, shot on the left side of the head.
At that point, were you aware of that? Did you know part of the investigation?
No. The only thing that I was asked was, was she right-handed or left-handed? She had electronic devices. She had a phone, a Nook, a laptop, several electronic devices that they were trying to access. And they would call me to try to figure out passwords or and so in my mind I'm thinking, with all the technology we have in the world, there's whether I can recall passwords or help them with passwords, they should be able to get into they should be able to bypass and get into and they never did access the devices to see who her last calls were, her last text messages. They told me they didn't have the capabilities of making that happen.
To be able to make it happen.
And so we that was never known,
6 months goes by. You get a ruling from the coroner's office.
6 months go by, and I receive her death certificate.
And you receive it third hand.
Third party.
And in your mind, you're thinking you're going to get one or the other.
When I opened it, I expected to see suicide or homicide.
And what did you see?
I saw cause of death, gunshot wound to the head, distant range of fire.
Distant range of fire.
Cause, manner of death, undetermined.
Then at that point, you're assuming more investigation must go on.
Right. I mean, it's undetermined. And then I realized at that point that the sheriff's department actually sat and waited on the coroner's office to make a decision. And nothing had been done in 6 months' time. The test firing of the weapon, stuff at the crime lab, at this point in time, within 6 months of time, where's the results from all the work the sheriff's department has done? And because the coroner has ruled it undetermined, it got filed. And I was told unless further evidence surfaced, there was nothing they could do.
And you actually wait to almost close to the 1 year anniversary. And then you get an attorney and do what?
Well, prior to that, after we got the undetermined, um, and it wasn't moving and nothing, nothing was happening, uh, I reached out to um, a pathologist who is not a forensic pathologist, but a pathologist who could point me in maybe the right directions.
Mm-hmm.
And so uh, it was recommended that I contact Dr. James Traylor, who was at LSU Shreveport, and he's the director of anatomical services there, and teaches forensic pathology
Mm-hmm.
at LSU Shreveport. And he had been the former Tangipahoa Parish coroner
Okay.
and had about 5,000 autopsies under his belt, and
Mm-hmm.
had been published and was just well known and had testified in many court cases.
Mm-hmm.
So I contacted him, and he then told me in order for him to be able to do anything and an objective determination, he needed the case file.
Mm-hmm.
He needed to be able to view what they had done, and then he could guide me from there. So I went back to the sheriff's department, requested that, was there anything else that could be done, and was told again that unless further evidence developed and surfaced, that there was nothing they could do. And so you had the first 6 months of time that you sat and waited for a death certificate,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And then she died in January. I got her death certificate, Bernie, on my anniversary, June the 5th. I made her funeral arrangements on my birthday, and I got her death certificate on my anniversary. And so that was the first 6 months. The next half of the year, the next 6 months, I spent begging for something to be done.
To be done. Something to be
And
tested,
so
something to be...
Something. And I knew that, the statute of limitations was running out
Mm-hmm.
for a wrongful death suit. I had no intentions of ever filing a wrongful death suit. That was not my
Right.
objective at all. But I knew in order to preserve anything that I could possibly get done in a proper chain of custody,
Mm-hmm.
I would have to do that. So on the actual anniversary of her death, a year to the date, I filed a wrongful death suit.
Mm-hmm.
And then that allowed my attorney to be able to gain access to things.
Mm-hmm.
And so none of that case file ever crossed my hands or my eyes or was in any of my possession
Mm-hmm.
at any time,
Mm-hmm.
So my attorney was able to secure the case file and the notes,
Mm-hmm.
the interviews and interrogation tapes and anything that had been done. And he sent that to Dr. James Traylor. And Dr. James Traylor opinioned back, I cannot comment, whether or not anything was properly or improperly done.
Mm-hmm.
These are my recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
Have the sheriff's department test fire that weapon, muzzle to target,
Mm-hmm.
because she was shot on the left side of the head. And the entry wound, he said, is going to tell the story. The science is going to tell us what happened to her. Your entry wound has no soot, stippling, or tattooing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he said, in order to be able to determine the distance from which she is shot, a distance determination testing with muzzle to target will need to be done on that weapon. And he said it needs to be done on a whiteboard, whereas, you have the muzzle to target, and, at target, you're going to have soot, stippling, or tattooing.
Mm-hmm.
But once you start backing that weapon up, when you get to a distance that there's no soot, stippling, or tattooing,
Mm-hmm.
then she's shot from that distance. Or greater.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it's greater than the distance of her arms, then it becomes humanly impossible to have self-inflicted.
Right. She could not have killed herself,
And then
could
he
not
said,
have shot
and
herself
then
to
you
death.
will know, Miss Walters. It will
Mm-hmm.
give you the answers that you are looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So armed with that,
Mm-hmm.
we take that to the sheriff's department.
Mm-hmm.
And waited and requested, never could get that weapon test fired, muzzle to target.
Was it ever done?
It was done at my expense, not theirs. When we subpoenaed the weapon and had it proper chain of custody with the weapon put into the hands of a retired, the next expert that we sought out, Dr. James Traylor was our first expert.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, he's a forensic pathologist, and he reviewed her autopsy, and he made the recommendation after reviewing the autopsy and looking at that she was actually shot from a distance, and we don't know what that distance is. And we do know that the entry wound had no soot, stippling, or tattooing. So then let's determine what's that distance.
Mm-hmm.
Get that weapon test fired. And it took quite some time to try to get that done. And when we hit a brick wall with that, we hired our second expert. Okay.
Who was your second expert, and what did you find out?
Our second expert was Mr. Charles Watson, who was retired from the Louisiana State Police as a firearms expert.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that weapon was placed into Mr. Watson's hands, who had the actual weapon and ballistics and, actually went and purchased ammunition,
Mm-hmm.
and test fired that weapon, multiple different scenarios,
Mm-hmm.
and his results came back that she was shot from 24 inches or greater.
24 inches or greater, meaning she could not have shot herself in the head.
Correct.
That's what your expert
right.
that you
because
hired.
that's 24 inches arm,
Mm-hmm.
shoulder to
Shoulder
fingertip.
to fingertips.
But then you have to come back around the head
to be able
to the left side of the
your
head.
Because she's right-handed.
She's
If she was right-handed, she would have
And
had
even
to
if
have
she
done that.
used both
Both
hands
hands.
with the thumb,
It wasn't possible.
the distance was, it was
Mhm.
not possible. So then we had those results. Okay, we sent that to the sheriff's department, and they sat on that for a while. And then our third expert that we hired was a gentleman by the name of Ross Gardner, and Mr. Gardner is from Atlanta,
Mm-hmm.
and he is a crime scene reconstructionist and analyst and bloodstain pattern expert. And he was sent the dimensions of the home, the layout of the home, the property, and where she was found, and did a reconstruction, and looked at Dr. Traylor's report, looked at Mr. Watson's report, and then he sent his opinionated report in. Now, these are all three different experts that are in different parts of the country, not connected in any way, shape, or form. And what I was looking for was to either have a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have? Are they consistent with each other,
Mm-hmm.
or do they deviate in any way, shape, or form? Because
Mm-hmm.
you have to realize none of them had the results of any of. They're all independent
Right.
reports.
Absolutely. Mr. Gardner tells you what?
Mr. Gardner tells me that it was humanly impossible for Miss Walters to have self-inflicted, and that given the distance that she is shot from and the layout of the home and the way her body was positioned and found, it was humanly impossible that there was a homicide that occurred in that home.
Cindy Walters is joining us. We are discussing the death of her daughter, Bethany, in 2016. Cindy, I want to fast forward now to just a couple of weeks ago. After much back and forth and wrangling, there are experts that are coming in to testify, okay? Mr. Guillory is going to be brought down. A jury has been sworn in to hear the case. And so you're sitting there expecting a trial. I mean, they've done everything they need to do. They've impaneled a jury to hear this case against Michael Guillory in the death of your daughter. Tell us what happens at that point.
Bernie, so once some movement got going on this case, and the sheriff's department actually
looked at the research
looked at it and said
information from people sought out.
Exactly. People that we sought out, then they realized that they had some probable cause there.
Absolutely.
And so they took that to a judge
Mm-hmm.
who reviewed everything and said, you know, the irony of it is the sheriff's department didn't on their own say we have probable cause.
Mm-hmm. You guys, as a family, hired these experts, and then, these experts end up turning over this information to the sheriff's office.
Correct. Remember, nothing was ever done after that.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that surfaced, any evidence that surfaced that got brought to the table was brought to the table from these experts.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay? So they take this to a judge to review. And a judge reviews and signs off for an affidavit, a warrant arrest on Mr. Guillory, and says, yes, you have probable cause.
Mm-hmm.
So then he is arrested. He's incarcerated, but he's arrested on these charges. And a grand jury hears this and hands down a true bill of indictment in January of 19. Okay? And so at that point, Bernie, it was like we took a deep breath.
I can see. I mean, even now, yes, because you're thinking,
oh my God, he's actually charged. We're,
and this was a guy who is a felon in possession of a firearm at the time that this happened, correct? The time that Bethany was shot. He was a felon in possession of a firearm. So he ended up being subsequently incarcerated because he had violated his parole by having the weapon.
Correct.
And now you have the indictment from this grand jury.
Correct.
You were thinking, oh my God, finally, we are at some point going to at least have a shot at accountability.
At this point, he's going to have a jury of his peers make a decision. Not the parents, not, this is going to be in 12 strangers.
That's right. The way our system works.
The way our system works.
Right.
The way our justice system works. And at this point, you realize that you now have to prepare yourself to accept whatever a jury is going to determine. And, with the fact that he may be found not guilty, or it may be a hung jury, or he may be found guilty of a lesser charge. But at least you're going to be able to hear some things that you maybe would have never heard, or formulate, what actually may or may not have happened.
You are a mother, and for your husband too. And I'm sure everyone in your family, but you as the mother, you want to know. I'm sure you wanted to know.
Both of us wanted to know.
Yeah.
Bernie, I buried her dad the day that we buried her.
He's broken.
Yeah. He's very quiet, but he's very broken. But he's not as vocal as I am. He's a behind-the-scenes person. But I had to watch him die daily. And so when we got the news, that, a grand jury had handed down a true bill of indictment and that he was going to be charged, then the district attorney then met with me because he now had a case. Okay?
And who was the district attorney at that time in 2019?
The district attorney was... I actually met with with the two assistant district attorneys that actually had, I don't know what's the terminology, but they had conducted the grand jury.
Right. Okay.
And that was Mr. Charles Cravens and a Mr. Taylor in the DA's office at that time. Mr. Earl Taylor was the district attorney. And then somewhere in that point in time, after he was charged and had gotten put on a docket, this was July 19th, we were set for trial in 20. Okay,
in the year 2020.
In 2020, when the onset, the pandemic hit.
And here comes this pandemic.
And at that time, Mr. Taylor was resigning, and an interim DA was put in. I think it was Mr. Charles Cravens who became the interim DA. Okay? But the interim district attorney was the one that had conducted the grand jury. Okay? And secured that that indictment,
Mm-hmm.
and so they were taking it to trial.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it was going to go to trial several times in 2020, but there was a moratorium on jury trials at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and you couldn't have jurors
Being
6 feet apart.
right.
At one time
Absolutely.
they had even considered maybe trying to try this in the Civic Center
Mm-hmm.
in Opelousas, but because of security, and it's not
Wasn't
set
that
up,
wasn't
it's not
feasible?
properly, it
Yeah.
wasn't feasible,
Yeah.
but
Mm-hmm. Actively
they were
trying to do
actively
this.
going to try this case in 2020. There was
Mm-hmm.
not we were never led to believe, even with the newly elected district attorney who
Mm-hmm.
took office in January.
Yeah, you were always led to believe we're going to trial.
And at that point, after he was charged,
Mm-hmm.